Outrage and protest in the United States after a brutal police beating results in the death of yet another black man. Hi everyone, I'm Sean Calebs filling in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Welcome everyone. The United States is again confronted with an all too familiar issue, police brutality. People took to the streets over the weekend after camera footage showed officers violently attacking a man during a traffic stop in Memphis, Tennessee that turned deadly. 29-year-old Tyre Nichols was just yards away from home when Memphis police pulled him over. Law enforcement dragged him from his vehicle and began tasing him, later beating him. Nichols made an attempt to run away, but the officers caught him and the assault continued. He was taken to a hospital but died from his injuries 3 days later. The 5 police officers involved have been fired and charged with second-degree murder. Another one was just removed from his position as well. The move coming fewer than 3 weeks after the violent incident. The victim's family attorney says the quick indictments should be a blueprint for holding police departments accountable in the future. Well, to discuss this and more, let's bring in our guest. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Ronald Hampton. He's the former executive director of the National Black Police Association and retired D.C. Metropolitan Police officer. From California, Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey is a retired Los Angeles Police Department and author as well of the book Black and Blue, The Creation of a Social Advocate. Also in Washington, D.C., Joseph Williams is a former senior editor of U.S. News and World Report. And in Tennessee, Reverend Dr. Rosalind R. Nichols is the organizing pastor at Freedom's Chapel Christian Church. I'd like to welcome all of you to the program. Thanks very much. Dr. Nichols, I'll begin with you. You're in Memphis right now, and everybody saw what unfolded Friday evening and on through the weekend. What can you tell us about the mood there now and your thoughts on the way demonstrations did unfold across the nation over the weekend?
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I would like to say that the activists and organizers in my hometown executed their protest honoring the request of the family that we protest but be peaceful. And so that is indeed what happened in the city. I think the country was expecting Memphis to explode, but we were honoring what was asked of us because Tyre Nichols was a man of peace. And we wanted to demonstrate that even in the activism.
Yeah, and Mr. Hampton, your thoughts as well. You're a former D.C. police officer. You've sadly been down this road before where you've seen demonstrations unfold in the street. I want to get your thoughts on the attacking officers, those 5 officers who were initially charged with a second-degree murder. A lot, of course, being said about the fact that it was a young black man who was pulled over, and if you look at the officers, they are all black as well. Your thoughts on that? Because a lot of people are saying they're very quick to react to this. Why didn't it happen in other areas? But this was such a heinous assault.
Well, there was reasons why the action was so quick, and as in this case than other cases, but it took me immediately back to Rodney King, because the officers not only knew exactly what it was that they was doing, but they were doing it because he ran. And that was the same case in circumstances at Rodney King. Rodney King didn't stop for him, then he ran, but you know, even the beating, you could hear him complying every bit of the way in terms of the beating that he was taking. You could hear him say that. I had to be honest, I didn't look at it myself, but I heard it, I listened to it, and I wasn't surprised because, you know, reform hasn't taken place. That's why I don't use the term reform. Reform just hasn't happened. There were beatings when, and assaults by police officers when the officer in Minneapolis was on trial. And then the Washington Post just documented that 2022 was one of the brutalist years in terms
Right.
of police attack on citizens. So they haven't learned their lesson, and people like myself and some of the folks that's on the panel today have been talking about this a very long time, and yet nothing has been done about it.
We certainly are going to take our time talking about looking at the way reform needs to play out. But I'm curious, Mr. Hampton, why you didn't look at the video. Was this a choice that you made? I read an op-ed in the Washington Post that said the video is hard to look at it, but we do need to see it.
Oh, no. I saw it in my mind. And when I was a police officer, I've intervened in cases, and I was punished as a result and ostracized because I intervened in cases. So I saw it in my mind's eye. So I wasn't surprised or about what was happening and how it was happening, because I've seen it before. So I didn't have to see it again to be convinced that number one, that it shouldn't take place. Number one, number two, they didn't have a reason to do it. There was no probable cause to do it. He acquiesced every inch along the way.
Yeah.
And they just beat him. They beat him because he ran, and that takes place in police departments sometime almost every single day, and them carrying out their duties. So I didn't have to watch it to refamiliarize myself with the process of the brutal treatment from police officers. Yeah,
Well,
I didn't have to do it.
Sergeant Dorsey, I'd like to get your...
May I ask? May I offer something too from the perspective of a Memphian? Is that one, while I respect the experience and knowing that there is some sense that when someone runs from the police that makes it more aggressive, but I can tell you
it shouldn't.
No, but what I want to say is that at the level of the ground where we are in Memphis, we don't think that they beat him because he ran. We think that was the ultimate intent from the moment they stopped him.
Okay, we're going to...
Oh, it might have been. I don't disagree with that.
And so the sentiment is that this was premeditated and this was intended, and that we have this particular unit has this reputation in the city. We know that these units go on like this. And so we don't feel like this was the result of what he did. We think regardless of what he had done, this would have been the result.
Sergeant Dorsey, I want to bring you in on the discussion as well, because we've talked a lot about reform over the years throughout the media and certainly in the communities as well. And I want to play a soundbite from you from Ben Crump. This is what the civil rights attorney had to say about having police reform.
We have to have this conversation because this institutionalized police culture that suggests you can do this to people in certain communities who look a certain way cannot be tolerated. It doesn't matter if the officer is a black officer, a Hispanic officer, or a white officer. It is the culture that allows them to think they can do this to Tyre.
Sergeant Dorsey, I'd like to get your take on that, and also the fact that this Scorpion unit, the unit that was created by the police chief in Memphis to go out and handle violent crime, has been disbanded in the aftermath of this.
Well, let me say this, having worked as a patrol officer and a patrol sergeant during my 20-year career on the Los Angeles Police Department, I understand the nuances of how officers work and think. And I appreciate what Mr. Crump is saying, but I know what he knows not. And having a federal law, the George Floyd Reform and Justice Act, would do nothing to stop what we witnessed. It's on the local police chiefs to rein in their officers. You can have a federal law, and the George Floyd Justice and Reform Act addresses things that really local police officers are the ones that engage in that, such as no-knock warrants. That act would prohibit federal no-knock warrants, but it would do nothing to stop a local agency from engaging in a service of a no-knock warrant. And we've already heard from the GOP and a Republican Senator Tim Scott that with removing qualified immunity, which absolutely must happen,
right,
it becomes a non-starter and a moot issue. And so we will never get to any real substantive change. With regards to the Scorpion unit being disbanded, that was just a baby step. Those officers have been now moved back to patrol. They're still out there pulling folks over today. And so
not the officers involved in
the
this
unit,
beating.
Pardon me?
Not the officers involved in this beating. They're not back on patrol. To what are...
There
No,
are
but
40,
the unit, but those who are in the unit beyond those
see what you-
5.
there are 40 officers in the Scorpion task force. And while 5 of them have been charged, there are many others who were standing around watching, who acquiesced that misconduct, who may have been involved to a lesser degree, who have that same mindset, that same let's catch him and stomp his ass kind of mentality. And so they're still on the department. And I'm bothered by the fact that we have in Chief Davis someone who has 20 plus years of law enforcement experience, who has been an administrator on 3 different police departments, and then creates this unit, gives this unit the name Scorpion, which in and of itself is aggressive.
That's right.
With inexperienced officers who are unsupervised by her own admission, and then just unleashes them on an unsuspecting public.
Mr. Williams, I want to bring you in. Let's talk more about that, and also just the whole discussion of racism. It has to be involved when something like this happens, even if it's black officers involved with a young black man.
Well, it's a Rubik's Cube of race, because the institution of police and law enforcement, and I will defer to Mr. Hampton and Ms. Dorsey because they have on-the-street experience, but I was a police reporter in the 80s in Richmond, and I did that for a couple of years, and I saw firsthand that it is a culture, and that a lot of times, if you're a black officer wearing the uniform and the badge, the question is not whether or not you are a black officer in uniform, but you are asked the question very often, are you black or are you blue? And that happens inside squad rooms, it happens on the street, and the culture and the nature of policing is such that it is steeped in racism. It is steeped in racial division. The DNA of law enforcement has a lot of that running through it. And so if you're on the street and you have to make a decision whether or not you're going to be black or blue, it's a really tough call. And I know Officer Hampton mentioned that he tried to intervene in a beating and was disciplined for it. That to me is absolutely not a surprise. And furthermore, names like Scorpion Unit, in DC it was the Jump Squad.
That's right.
They're created
It's
to
the Jump
address
Squad in
real world
Memphis.
problems. Right, and they're created to address real world problems, which is crime in impoverished neighborhoods. Now, every city in America is going through this right now. DC, Philadelphia, New York, spikes in crime, spikes in homicides. Here in DC, it's carjacking. So officers and law enforcement professionals are under pressure to bring that down. So they create these units that are very aggressive. They create units that have a culture to them that are almost like street gangs with tough sounding names, aggressive names. In DC, they had tattoos, they had T-shirts. But the point is the same. The objective is still the same, to try to bring down crime. Now, we know that as educated professionals, you cannot arrest your way out of a situation like this. These are deep-seated problems that have to do with poverty, education, lack of investment in communities, and to create units like these, you're just addressing a Band-Aid on the solution, and you're possibly making it worse. However, if you take a big picture, look at it, not only is the institution of policing inherently got racial problems, but the problems that they're addressing in communities were created in fact by racism, by redlining, by disinvestment, by marginalization. Therefore, you've got kind of this Rubik's Cube situation where one solution is not going to solve these problems, but we seem unwilling to address with a holistic solution ways to bring crime down and ways to get officers to be less aggressive and ways to overhaul policing in ways that enhance public safety, not threaten it.
Very insightful comments. I'd like the panel to listen to what Ben Crump, hang on 1 second, please. I'll come right to you. I just want you to hear what Ben Crump has to say about a need for a civil rights investigation.
It doesn't matter if the hand who pulled the trigger, who killed your son, was a black hand or a white hand. The pain is still the same. It didn't matter. Yeah. The pain is still the same. And that's why we're here. You know, Reverend Al talked to the family, and he talked about people have this misnomer that we're anti-white cops. No, we're anti-bad cops. It doesn't matter what race they are.
Dr. Nichols, I know you had something to say.
Yes, I would like to just kind of dovetail also into that conversation. You know the malignancy of this culture because the officers, as we all know now, there were body cams, there were street cams, and there, when you watch this unfolding, there was literally no reservation. It was with impunity. There was no sense that, this is going to go. So that's just how deep. And this particular Scorpion unit is not only pervasive across the country, but just 4 days before Tyre Nichols was murdered, this same unit had been reported to internal affairs and no one had responded. So if someone had even responded 4 days prior, but the culture is so malignant until that was never expected. These officers never expected anyone to hold them accountable to anything that they were going to do.
Sergeant Dorsey.
The only reason why they were held accountable is because their victim died. And because the family of the victim was consistent in making sure that justice was seen.
Look,
because yes.
No, what I was going to say was, the chief looked at the tape. He or she is going to be the first one to look at the tape. She also read the statement. And in the Rodney King incident, the statement was a lie. It was a bald-faced lie. So she was responsible and had to do something. There was no reason or rationale, probable cause, or any kind of cause for for them pulling them over and what they did. So she didn't have any other response but to get rid of them, because she also ultimately had to cover her own ass. And that's what she was doing. But I don't believe that this is going to be, that this is a watershed moment in policing. We thought that George Floyd's incident was a watershed moment. And I'm telling you, it hasn't.
Sergeant Nichols,
it has not been.
Sergeant Nichols, I'd like to get your take on all of this, and also drawing from your experience as an author, researching this and also living it. What is a way to move forward? How can there be real police reform? Again, to Dr. Nichols, to Sergeant.
Well, what has to happen, I mean, there are many things that need to happen, but certainly there needs to be an end to qualified immunity so that officers can be held personally responsible for these bad deeds. If you don't do anything to deter the bad behavior, we know that these officers will continue to misbehave. Listen, that Scorpion unit has been in existence is reported over a year and a half, and we saw how easily they were able to abuse Mr. Nichols, because this is what they've been doing, I would imagine, for a year and a half. And I would imagine that when they do that, they get together in a group like the 6 that we saw standing around lying about the probable cause for the detention and the need for the unnecessary use of force. And because great deference is given to a police officer's version of events, when a citizen comes in to complain, apparently the police chief just foo-fooed them away. Had she done her job, had she investigated those errant officers, perhaps Mr. Nichols would be alive today. And so what needs to happen is that there needs to be an independent audit, I believe, of every one of these special task force across these 18,000 police departments. Let's identify who the errant officers are, and let's get them off the unit and maybe off the police department. There needs to be a reckoning for these officers, and there needs to be, in the case of Minneapolis, Memphis specifically, supervision. You can't have officers on a special unit who have no time on the job, who have no experience, obviously no common sense, and let them go unsupervised. It's the role of a supervisor to come on those calls, monitor the officers' activities, and if they get engaged in a use of force incident, then to manage it. Because we know that those officers had no problem lying about the use of force, not only to their supervisors, but to Tyre Nichols' mom when they went to her home and said, oh, your son was in a traffic accident. I mean, he was arrested for DUI. We had to mace him. He's on his way to the hospital. They're going to treat him and then book him. They knew very well that he was not going to be booked. He had a broken neck and was in critical condition. And so all of these things need to be looked at with a fine-tooth comb.
Sister,
And I would like to say that in Memphis,
hang
I
on.
would like to add that in Memphis, we have been having ongoing, so I want to go to a deeper place also, that we have been having these exact ongoing conversations. So it's not like this has jumped off in Memphis and we're trying to discuss it. But I also think that what needs to be addressed and raised as well is, do we fundamentally have the capacity as a community, as law enforcement, wherever it starts, with really what it's going to take to make the change? Because it's going to hurt and it's going to require some deep sacrifices and some shifts and changes. So really fundamentally, the question is, do we have the wherewithal? Do we have what we are going to need within our guts and our lives to make the change? And that is up for debate, quite honestly. We can do all of this knowledge and knowing and not have a bit of change because we don't have the guts to do it.
Dr. Nichols, can I even offer in the group, can I even offer a much more wider? Well, I believe that we ought to be looking at reimagining the role of police as well as some of the other criminal justice components in our society. I don't believe police ought to be responding to calls for mental health. I don't believe that police ought to respond to calls for juveniles. I don't believe police ought to be responding to calls for domestic violence. And if we look at it that way, then we can reduce the footprint of police in our community. Why do we have a system where we call somebody to come provide a service to us that beat the hell out of us? And even if they don't beat the hell out of us, they don't provide the service related to the call and the reason why we called them. And again, so why we continue to support a system that does not do what it is that we need to do. So reimagining the role, looking at what it is that they do, the effectiveness of it, and if they don't do it, take it and give it to somebody who goes to school to get it done. Police do not. It hasn't worked.
Mr.
I mean, no disrespect, but may I just throw this in? We just went through about 2 years ago a series of conversations about that. Actually, it was on the heels of George Floyd in Memphis, Tennessee. We, under the direction of our mayor, went through a series of conversations, community involved, around reimagining policing in the city. That was exactly what it was called. We also, in the organization I'm a part of, have been addressing issues about mental health and how you divert it from policing. We have also had another organization working in Memphis around police and traffic stops, that should never have happened. What happened? What I'm saying is, you can have that, but at the same time, if you don't have a will to make the change, here we are discussing it and nothing will happen.
Mr. Williams, I want to bring you in again because I spent most of my life in the street reporting, and I covered the Rodney King riots back in the early 90s, so I'm that old. I've seen this, and one thing I think that has been effective in showing this does go on much more frequently than people believe is the phone, the iPhone, whatever. People are now grabbing these images and bringing them to life, and that's led, of course, to body cams for police officers. I want you to talk about that and your experience reporting as well, and kind of weigh in on this effort to find a way to reform. And I think it's also going to be interesting because Tyre Nichols' mother and father will be in the gallery during Biden's State of the Union address Tuesday, February 7th. So this issue obviously is going to get even more attention once that rolls around.
Well, I'll make the last point first, and that is, yes, they will be in the gallery. Yes, it's going to be quite an honor. No, nothing will change because there's not the political will in Congress, even though symbolism is going to be very powerful. The political will there is not going to be strong enough. Washington, D.C. attempted to undertake a reform of its criminal code to try to make punishment align more closely with what is actually happening, and the Republicans are ready to bite it, to vote it down because D.C. doesn't have that autonomy, which to me is just a demonstration that real reform and real substantive change is not on the national agenda, and that's what it's going to take because there are 18,000 police departments across the country. Each one has its own individual rules, and the culture on all of them is nearly identical. It will take a national effort to bring this problem under control. Until that happens, we're going to be talking about this again. The second point, the second point you wanted me to make first is about police cameras. Rodney King, the videotape was there, the officers were acquitted. Everything that we've had up to this point has not really proven that videotape is going to be the deciding factor. We have very many instances where the cops are wearing body camera and it happens to malfunction, or we can't get the tape, or the tape is being withheld in a public records request. Even in this Memphis case, it's being held as a paragon of how it should be handled. It still took a full 2 weeks before the tape got released and before everything came out in the open. So there still is this culture and this reluctance to be transparent. And in discussing my time on the street as a cop reporter, I very much ran into that culture. I very much felt like a black man covering a white institution. It was very challenging to get people to talk to me about things because I was not a part of the culture. And it was hard to discern whether or not that was because I was a reporter or because I was black. And mind you, I was covering it in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. So it probably was equal parts both. Equal parts police culture, suspicious of an outsider, and a black man covering a predominantly white institution. Either way, it speaks to the broader issue here, which is way more intractable, in my opinion.
Sergeant Dorsey, I want to go to you. We're kind of tight on time, but I want to read this quote from Alexis Hogue Forger, a professor at Brooklyn Law School and co-director of the Center for Criminal Justice, talking with the media over the week. Policing in this country is focused on control, subordination, and violence, regardless of the race of the officer. Society views black people as inherently dangerous and criminal. Even if you have black people in the position of law enforcement, that doesn't mean the proposition goes away. I want to get your final word on this.
Absolutely. I mean, you have officers who are indoctrinated, who are working in a situation that's predicated upon white supremacy and who bled blue, who could not look at Tyre Nichols and relate to him and think that this could be my brother or this could be my uncle and treat him accordingly. And so when you have officers who are engaging in, wolf pack mentality, group think, you're going to have these kinds of situations. And that's why it's so important to have psychological evaluations, do a thorough background check before you hire these people, investigate personnel complaints when they come in. And if you find that there's someone who doesn't have the temperament or the skill set to do this job effectively, compassionately, and relate to the community that they're serving, then you need to get them off the department.
Dr. Nichols, I want to give you the final word. We only have about 30 seconds. Tell me what you think people need to know that I haven't asked yet.
That Memphis is not, when all of this is gone out of the news rotation, that we will still be on the streets as we were before Tyre was murdered. But more importantly, between now and next January, we're determined to be able to see some change in our city. And it is going to be hard and painful, but it's necessary.
Okay, I'm going to come out to Memphis and do a story with you. You guys have been wonderful. I've learned a lot during this. Hope everyone else did as well. We have to leave it there. I'm Sean Calebs in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching another edition of The Heat.
The world economy